Welcome to today's podcast. We're discussing The Crux by Richard Rumelt, author of Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. The book emphasizes a distinct approach to strategy. It argues that the common practice of starting with goals is often misguided. Rumelt argues that much of what passes for strategic planning is often a distraction, focusing on aspirations and financial targets rather than the essential work of understanding and addressing critical challenges. He dispels the notion that there exists a strategy calculator, a formulaic approach to generating a successful plan. Instead, Rumelt posits that effective strategy stems from identifying and deeply understanding the challenges an organization faces. He calls this challenge-based strategy, opposing conventional thinking. Rumelt argues that setting goals before comprehending the problem is like trying to solve an equation without knowing all the variables. He states, don't start with goals, start by understanding the challenge and finding its crux. The Crux offers a refreshing and insightful perspective on strategy. By emphasizing challenge-driven thinking, rigorous diagnosis, and coherent action, Rumelt provides a valuable roadmap for leaders seeking to navigate complexity, overcome obstacles, and achieve lasting success in a dynamic and competitive world. So let's dive into today's podcast. As always, please share, like, and subscribe.
Ever feel like you're just, stuck at the bottom of this huge challenge, like you're looking up at it and it just seems impossible? Yeah, exactly. All right, so today we are really diving deep into this idea of strategy with this book, The Crux by Richard Rumelt. And this book is refreshing because it kind of throws out all those kind of tired old business school cliches about strategy, and it really tries to get to the heart of what it means to make effective decisions in the face of complexity, which, let's be honest, is pretty much all of us all the time, right?
Absolutely.
So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack how to identify those make or break points in any challenge,
right?
Whether you're, building a business, you're trying to, level up your personal life, whatever it is.
Yeah. And what I find so fascinating about Rumelt's approach is that he starts with this really unexpected analogy, rock climbing.
Yeah, he kicks off the book with this really vivid scene of climbers tackling this notoriously difficult boulder problem. And it's called, get this, le toit du cul du chien, which translates to, well, let's just say it involves a dog and leave it at that.
Right. It's more than just a colorful name, though. Yeah. What struck Rumelt as he was watching these climbers was just how much of the challenge was mental. They weren't just muscling their way up this rock. They were having to really analyze the rock face, figure out the precise sequence of moves to overcome this, what they call the crux.
So it's like that one move,
yeah,
that once you figure it out, the rest of the climb kind of opens up.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the essence of what Rumelt calls the crux.
Okay.
It's that pivotal point in any challenge, often hidden in plain sight, where success hinges. And it's about, really focusing your energy on that bottleneck, not just trying harder across the board.
Okay, so how do we go from scaling literal cliffs to conquering the metaphorical ones in our work and our life? Because I'm guessing not everyone listening is about to go hang off a rock face.
Right. But the principle applies whether you're launching a business or writing a book or even figuring out how to make rockets reusable.
You're talking about Elon Musk and SpaceX?
Exactly.
Okay.
Think about their challenge. Everyone knew reusable rockets were this pipe dream, too expensive, too complex.
Right. Everyone told them reusable rockets were insanely expensive.
Right, because of the whole re-entry from space thing.
Exactly. But Musk, he looked at it and said, what's the real problem here? What's the crux?
It wasn't the re-entry technology itself. It was the cost of the fuel if you're launching a whole new rocket every single time.
So he's like, okay, more fuel, slower re-entry, reusable rockets. Problem solved.
Exactly. Instead of getting bogged down in all the technical details, Musk looked for the real crux.
Which was?
The assumption that you had to design the entire rocket for this fiery return trip. By focusing on more efficient engines and landing procedures, they cracked the crux.
Wow.
Not only making reusability possible, but, they revolutionized space travel in the process. He found a different crux than everyone else was looking at.
So it's about challenging those deeply held assumptions that we've always done it this way mentality.
Absolutely.
Okay, so lesson 1. Find that make or break point, find your crux. But how do we avoid getting stuck in that trap ourselves? I have a feeling this book is also about busting some myths about what strategy isn't.
Oh, absolutely. Rumelt takes on some pretty common misconceptions head on. For example, strategy is not just setting a goal. He argues that too many businesses fall into the trap of these generic strategies, these buzzwords like cost leadership or differentiation, without really understanding the underlying challenge.
Okay, so he's saying we need to diagnose before we prescribe.
Yes.
Kind of like a doctor wouldn't just throw antibiotics at every ailment that walks in the door.
Yeah, precisely. So it's not about just picking from some predetermined list of options. It's about really understanding the specific challenge in front of you, finding that unique pathway forward.
So it's less about the what and more about the how.
Exactly. And it's about finding your crux.
Yeah, because otherwise my strategy could be, learn to play the banjo.
Right. It's a goal, sure, but is it a strategy? Not really.
And he uses the example of the Curtiss-Wright company, right?
Yeah, they were big in the aircraft engine business, but they totally fixated on the rotary engine.
They were like, rotary engine or bust.
Pretty much. Convinced it was the future. Poured tons of resources into it, even when it wasn't panning out the way they had hoped.
So they fell into that trap of thinking the goal was the strategy.
Exactly.
Which, honestly, haven't we all been there at some point? You get so focused on the what that you totally forget about the how.
It's a classic pitfall for sure. He even shares this cautionary tale from his own consulting work. He worked with this company called Paradigm, and their CEO, Carl Lang, was obsessed with these textbook strategies. Wanted the quick fix, the easy answer.
Oh, I've worked for that guy.
Right.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
And Rumelt had to really kind of steer him back and figure out what's actually going wrong before you start trying to fix it. And it leads us to another myth Rumelt tackles. The idea that strategy equals, good management.
Because if you're managing things well, you must have a good strategy.
Right. It should just follow naturally. But Rumelt pushes back on that.
He uses the example of Robert McNamara, right?
Yeah.
Secretary of Defense during Vietnam, the whole management by objectives guy.
Exactly. Rumelt even points out that McNamara later admitted this whole approach, it was failing in Vietnam. They were hitting their targets, but it wasn't actually getting them closer to their objective.
So managing the heck out of the wrong things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he contrasts that with this really interesting case study in the book, The Delca Company.
Delca?
Yeah. They were in the PC component business back in the day when it was a tough industry to be in, even back then.
So what was their strategy? Did it just have a really cool name?
Well, a cool name never hurts, but their success, it really came down to understanding the real crux. They realized their customers, the computer manufacturers, they were struggling with a very specific problem, which was heat. Yeah. Computers were getting faster and faster, but they were also getting hotter and hotter, which, as you can imagine, causes all sorts of problems.
Yeah, no kidding. Meltdown. So what did they do? Did they just all become tiny air conditioning salespeople?
In a way, yeah. Delca realized their expertise, their crux, was in cooling fans. And they figured out how to adapt that to solve this computer overheating problem.
Interesting.
So they found a new crux, a new customer need, and they basically pivoted their entire business.
It's like they found that handhold, that strategic advantage that nobody else even realized was there.
Exactly. And that's the power of understanding the real crux of the situation.
It's easy to get caught up in trying to solve, the wrong problem,
Oh, totally.
Rumelt uses another great example in the book, Dean Foods. I mean, you think, milk. How complicated can it be?
Right. It's milk.
But apparently very complicated.
Yeah. Rumelt explains how Dean Foods, huge dairy company, right? They were getting hit from all sides, rising costs, fluctuating milk prices.
So classic commodity market squeeze.
Exactly.
So what did they do?
Well, they doubled down on efficiency. If we can just squeeze every last penny out of our system, we'll be fine.
Classic case of mistaking management for strategy.
Totally.
Like trying to outclimb the problem instead of finding the right handhold.
Their real problem wasn't inefficiency. It was that they were stuck in a commodity market. They had very little control over pricing.
Which, ouch, that's a tough spot to be in. So what happened? Did they manage to, turn things around?
They ended up having to make some really tough choices. Like they spun off some of their more successful brands like Horizon Organic, Silk Soy Milk. Wow.
Yeah, it really highlights that sometimes strategy isn't about getting better at what you're already doing. It's about recognizing when the game itself has changed.
Knowing when to hold them, knowing when to fold them.
Exactly. It's like, if you're digging yourself into a hole, the first step is to, like, stop digging.
Exactly.
Right? Or in this case, stop throwing buzzwords at the problem.
Exactly. Rumelt actually compares it to failing schools.
Okay.
You can pour more money in, you can try new programs, but until you actually understand why those schools are failing, you're not going to see real change.
Right.
And that's where so many businesses go wrong. They're so busy chasing solutions that they never actually stop to diagnose the real crux of their problem.
Like Carolyn and her clueless boss.
Oh, absolutely.
That story in the book still makes me cringe.
It's a perfect example of like misdirected effort.
Yeah.
They're laser focused on sales targets, pushing everyone to sell more.
Yeah.
When the real problem is their product, it's clunky, it's confusing. Nobody actually wants the darn thing. Okay, so we've talked about what strategy isn't. It's not just setting goals. It's not just being a management whiz. Let's get to the good stuff. Where does real advantage come from? What makes a strategy, really stand out?
Rumelt, he outlines several sources of advantage, and he does it with some really, really memorable examples. Like one that really stuck with me was the Google Pixel Buds translation fail.
Oh, yeah, I remember this. You'd think Google, of all companies, would have language translation down pat.
Right.
What happened there?
They promised this like totally seamless real-time translation, but it didn't work as advertised.
And it highlights that information advantage. While super powerful, it's only as good as the information itself.
It's like that old saying, garbage in, garbage out, right?
Right.
But then there's also know-how, right? And for that, he has this whole breakdown of Nokia.
Yeah, the rise and fall of Nokia.
They were the kings of the mobile phone.
You were.
And then gone.
They completely missed the smartphone revolution, even though they had many of the pieces in place. Rumelt argues that one of the big reasons was their organizational structure.
Interesting.
Yeah, it stifled innovation. It prevented them from adapting to this whole new world of touch screens and apps and everything.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, though, right?
It is.
Getting caught up in the day-to-day chasing numbers without taking the time to step back and ask, are we even working on the right things?
That is exactly why understanding this idea of the crux is so powerful. It's about shifting your focus from generic solutions to identifying that unique leverage point in your situation.
So how do we actually do that?
Right.
Because Rumelt throws around all these real-world examples.
Yeah.
But it still feels kind of abstract. How does Netflix solving its content costs problem apply to, say, someone running a small bakery?
That's a great point. The key isn't to just blindly copy what others have done,
right,
but to really understand the principles behind their success.
Okay. So even if you have all the right people, all the right knowledge, that's not enough.
Nope.
If you're not set up to actually work together effectively, to share ideas, to innovate,
all of that
advantage can disappear practically overnight. Makes you think about your own team, doesn't it?
It does.
Are you set up in a way that fosters innovation? Or are there all these invisible barriers holding you back?
That's a great question. So let's unpack the Netflix example a bit further.
Okay.
So back in 2018, they were facing this perfect storm. Content costs were exploding.
Yeah.
Competitors like Disney and Amazon were popping up left and right, throwing billions of dollars at original shows and movies.
It was scary even as a consumer. It was oh my gosh, how are they all going to keep this up?
Right.
Yeah.
And if they had just played the same game as everyone else, just trying to outspend the competition on these Hollywood blockbusters,
right,
they probably would have lost.
Yeah, it felt unsustainable at a certain point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's where their strategic thinking comes in. They identified this potential Crux international production.
So instead of just focusing on making shows and movies for U.S. audiences, they look globally.
Exactly. They already had this head start in international markets.
Okay.
And they realized that by tapping into this diverse creative talent around the world, they could achieve two things.
Okay.
First, they could develop all this unique content that their competitors weren't even considering.
Interesting.
And second, they could do it more cost effectively by accessing these production hubs outside of Hollywood's, totally inflated budgets.
That's brilliant. So it's like they found a way to differentiate themselves.
Yes.
And address the cost issue at the same time.
Exactly.
Just by identifying that one crucial leverage point.
Right. And it's not just about the internal stuff either. There's also positional advantage.
Which is all about network effects, right?
Yeah, network effects.
Like brand recognition. Yeah. All those things that give you a head start, just, I don't know, because of where you already are in the market. Like, everyone uses Google, right?
Right.
So how could, some new search engine even compete?
Exactly. Rumelt uses the example of early Microsoft.
Oh, yeah.
With their basic programming language.
Oh, right.
It wasn't necessarily, the best tech at the time.
Yeah.
But it was everywhere.
It's ubiquitous.
Exactly. And that gave them a huge advantage.
Just like Facebook today, right?
Totally.
Once you have that many users, that much influence, good luck to anyone trying to knock you off that top spot.
It's really hard to beat that.
Yeah. But it's not just about lucking into that position, right?
Positional advantage, just like any advantage, isn't about just stumbling into the right spot at the right time.
You have to be ready for it.
It's about expecting to profit from that position, having a strategic reason for being there.
I like that, expecting to profit.
And Rumelt emphasizes this, understanding the dynamics of your specific industry, your organization's capabilities, all of that, finding that unique combination. That's where the real edge is.
It's not enough to just be I want to be the next Google. Or I want to be the next Facebook. You need to figure out what your unique advantage is. Something that other people can't just easily copy.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, how often are we missing those kinds of opportunities in our own businesses?
Right.
What assumptions are we making that might be blinding us to a totally different approach?
Excellent question.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to dig into next.
Okay.
Because while the specifics of Netflix's challenge might not apply to every business,
right,
the principle behind it, finding that unique strategic edge that's universal.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Give me another example.
Okay.
How about a company that's not a multi-billion-dollar streaming giant?
Sure. Let's talk about Basecamp.
Okay.
They're all about simplifying project management, offering this really streamlined alternative to all that clunky, feature-heavy software that's just dominating the market.
Yeah, I've heard of them. They're like the anti-complexity crusaders of the project management world.
Exactly.
Right.
They recognize that for a lot of businesses, the tools themselves were actually part of the problem.
Interesting.
So their crux was recognizing this and focusing on simplicity and ease of use.
Okay.
And that's how they carved out their niche.
So instead of trying to compete on features, they differentiated themselves by solving a different problem.
Yeah.
The problem of software being too damn complicated.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a great example of how identifying the right crux can lead to this winning strategy. And it's a question you should be asking yourself constantly. What is the real problem that I'm solving? And is there a different, potentially more effective way to address it?
So we've talked about finding the crux, right? Identifying sources of advantage. But how do you actually navigate this whole strategy thing? It's not like there's a map,
right,
with a big dotted line.
Well, and Rumelt actually uses this really great analogy here. He says, imagine you're the captain of a ship.
Okay.
You've got your destination in mind, but you need to be ready to, adjust your course. Because there are winds, there are currents. Storms, exactly. All these unexpected things that pop up all the time.
And sometimes those storms, they're Category 5 hurricanes. So you really got to be on your toes.
And you can't be afraid to change course if the situation calls for it.
Sometimes the best strategy is admitting you were wrong, right? You got to adapt.
Totally. You have to be willing to learn and adapt as you go.
And that's where I think this whole thing of making your assumptions explicit comes in, right? What are you basing your strategy on? What are you just taking for granted?
It's so easy to just kind of go with the flow and not question those underlying assumptions.
But then you end up way off course. So it's about constantly challenging those assumptions, right? Asking yourself the tough questions and being open to changing course, which I'll be honest, isn't always easy.
It can be tough.
It can be tough. But the good news is we don't have to navigate these strategic waters alone.
You don't.
Rumelt, he gives us this whole framework. He calls it the strategy foundry. What is that all about?
It's a process, really. It's about putting these ideas into practice. And one of the key elements is this: diverse perspectives.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Get people in a room who can challenge each other's assumptions, who bring, totally different viewpoints to the table. That's where the magic happens.
It's about having those, like, sometimes uncomfortable conversations.
Right.
Ones that really make you question everything.
Exactly.
Because in the end, that's how you get to a truly innovative, effective strategy.
You don't want to be stuck in an echo chamber.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need those different voices, those different perspectives to really challenge your thinking. And hey, don't forget about the power of learning from others too. Okay. I'm starting to see how this all comes together. But before we go any further, there's something I've been kind of wondering about.
Yeah.
Rumelt talks a lot about, avoiding those generic strategies, finding your unique crux.
Right.
But doesn't that sometimes just boil down to, like, making more money?
Right.
Like, isn't that the end goal for most businesses anyway?
It's a common misconception.
Okay.
And Rumelt actually tackles this head on with a story about this CEO named Bob Haller.
Okay.
And Bob was laser focused on hitting this specific revenue target.
Okay.
He had this sales growth chart that he treated like it was like a sacred relic, convinced that reaching that magic number was like the be-all and end-all of success.
Everything's about hitting those quarterly numbers.
Yeah, right. And that's the danger of what Rumelt calls this like 90-day derby.
Okay.
This relentless pressure to show these short-term gains that it can actually sabotage your long-term strategy.
So it's like sprinting towards a finish line that keeps moving.
Exactly. You end up making decisions that look good on paper,
Yeah.
but they ultimately undermine the health of your business.
Right. So you're not building anything sustainable. You're just kind of like chasing this,
Exactly.
yes, arbitrary target.
It's about sustainable growth, not just chasing these numbers.
Right.
And it all comes back to understanding your crux.
Okay.
Because if you're so fixated on this financial target, you might miss the real opportunities for innovation and differentiation.
Okay, so give me an example.
Okay, so take this company, Sendia Products.
Okay.
They set this ambitious goal of doubling their revenue in 5 years.
Sounds good on paper, right?
Right, sounds great. Who wouldn't want to double their revenue?
Exactly.
Problem was, they hadn't actually figured out how they were going to achieve it.
Oh, no.
They just threw a bunch of new initiatives at the wall, hoping something would stick, without any real strategic thinking behind it.
Yeah.
It was a disaster.
Oh, no.
Both of their big ideas totally flopped.
Wow.
And the CEO ended up getting fired.
Ouch.
It's like a cautionary tale about the dangers of mistaking financial goals for actual strategy.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap? Because let's be honest, like, we all face that pressure to deliver results to hit those numbers.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding your crux is so crucial. It's about making sure those short-term goals are aligned with your long-term vision. It's about constantly asking yourself, are we working on the right things?
Not just the things that...
Not just the things that look good on a spreadsheet.
Right. The things that make us feel good but might not actually be moving us towards
Exactly.
the big picture.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense, but it's still a bit fuzzy for me. Like, how do we actually put this into practice?
Yeah.
What are the questions we should be asking?
Well, remember that company FarmCore that Rumelt worked with?
Yeah.
He walks through this great case study where he asks them a series of really insightful questions.
Okay, like what?
Things like, what are your biggest challenges right now? What's worked for you in the past and what hasn't?
Sure.
And if you could look back 5 years from now, what would have to have happened to get you where you want to be?
It's like that time viewer exercise he talks about. Imagining your future success and then kind of reverse engineering the steps to get there.
Exactly. It's such a powerful way to shift your perspective
Yeah.
and really identify those key milestones, the cruxes that are going to define your path forward.
Okay.
Rumelt also talks about the importance of what he calls reference classes, looking at how other companies in similar situations have tackled their challenges.
So it's not about copying them, but more about understanding those patterns of like success and failure.
Right. It helps you to kind of break out of your own limited perspective and see the bigger picture.
Okay.
Because even though every situation is unique, there are often these really valuable lessons to be learned from those who've come before you.
Right. Of course, we don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. Okay, so that kind of leads us to like the million-dollar question. How do we find our cruxes?
Right. It starts with asking the right questions.
Okay.
Rumelt encourages us to think again,
Okay.
to really challenge those assumptions about our business and our industry.
Like, what are we taking for granted that if we actually stopped and thought about it, maybe we would do things differently?
Exactly. What are those unspoken rules, the that's just how it's done mentalities
Right.
that might be holding you back?
Yeah. So we need to put everything back on the table and examine it with fresh eyes,
Exactly.
with a new perspective.
And finally, remember that strategy is not this one-time event.
Right. It's a process.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
It's what Rumelt calls this like strategic navigation.
Okay.
This constantly monitoring your environment, tracking those key assumptions and being willing to adjust course when you need to.
So it's not about finding that one magic bullet solution,
Right.
but rather about developing this like flexible and adaptable approach to navigating the challenges as they come up.
Exactly. The business world is constantly evolving, and the companies that thrive are the ones that are able to identify their cruxes, adapt to change, and make those bold decisions when it matters most.
I love that. So as we wrap up here, I think the biggest takeaway from our deep dive is this. Strategy is a journey. It's not a destination. And you get to decide, are you going to be the captain of your ship? Charting your own course, adjusting to the ever-changing conditions, weathering those storms as they come? Or are you content to just be along for the ride? So for anyone listening who's feeling maybe a little stuck or overwhelmed or just unsure of their next move, just remember this. The answers aren't in a textbook or some business guru's formula. They're in understanding the unique dynamics of your situation, having the courage to challenge the status quo, and really focusing your energy on that one crucial point, that crux that can unlock your path to success.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
Awesome. Until next time.